Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me throughout these past couple weeks during the summer as we looked at Paul's missionary journeys and how God blessed the spread of the gospel through him. And as I said last week, today we're going to be looking at a trip that I had the privilege to take. At the seminary, we have to take winterim classes. So it's a 2-week period during January where we can either take classes in the classroom or we can go on trips. And I was fortunate enough to be able to take a trip to Greece and Italy and took a In the Footsteps of St. Paul tour. So throughout the weeks between January 4th and 16th, we got to travel throughout Greece and throughout Italy and put some visuals to the words that we read in the Bible about Paul and where he traveled and where he preached the message of the gospel. So not really a Bible study today, but I'm just going to take you through this presentation here. And all the pictures that you see throughout this presentation were ones that I took, minus the maps, obviously. And when I talk about places where we believe Paul was, we can kind of take those with a grain of salt because, of course, we don't 100% without a shadow of a doubt know where Paul was exactly in the cities that he stopped in, but we can make a pretty educated guess as to where he would have went when he went to all of these places and cities. So let's take the trip together here in the footsteps of St. Paul. So this is the trip that we took throughout Greece. We stayed in Greece for about a week. So we flew out of the U.S. and landed in Istanbul. So you can see that on the very top right of the map by the Black Sea. That's where we landed, had a layover, and then flew to Thessaloniki. Now you might be saying, well, that looks like it's spelled wrong. Well, actually, Thessaloniki is modern-day Thessalonica. So just kind of they changed the spelling a little bit once the city became more modern. But that's not where we really began our journey. We stayed in Thessaloniki because it was a big city, but we began our journey in Kavala. So we traveled northeast for a day and went up there to Kavala, and then we traveled to Thessaloniki back there and kind of looked around the city. Then we went to Veroia, Ionia, Preveza, Patrai, Corinth, and Athens. So we got to take a look at all these places where Paul was. And these are the places that we would stay for a little while as well. And so let's jump right in. Let's see Paul travels to Europe for the first time from Acts 16. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went to Neapolis. So now we're on Paul's second missionary journey. The first missionary journey, he just stayed in the area of Galatia and traveled around there. But on the second journey, he finally travels to Europe. And so we see here that he began in Troas. This is where he had this vision of the man in Macedonia. And you can see that's kind of the whole area by the Adriatic Sea, the Thessalonica area. And then they traveled and sailed across from Samothrace and then landed in Neapolis. But if you notice, Neapolis is kind of inland a little bit. So that's not exactly where Paul would have landed. But Paul would have landed in Kavala. So here's another map here. So he sailed across, landed in Kavala, which is right on the shore of the Aegean Sea. And so this is modern-day Kavala. You can see on the left there. And another picture of it, just a little bit over a little bit. You can see a couple of views there of the Aegean Sea. So this is where Paul would have landed when coming to Philippi. He would have landed right on these shores. Obviously, the buildings wouldn't have been there. But this is his first stop in Europe. Now, when you look at these pictures, maybe this doesn't seem too strange to you, but there's snow. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, there's snow. It's January. But in the Mediterranean area, it's a very temperate climate, so they don't get snow very often. And in fact, our tour guide said that this was the second time in 15 years that they ever had snow. And it just so happened to be there when all of these Midwesterners from Wisconsin decided to come over and visit there. So we kind of brought the snow with us, and we definitely weren't prepared for that kind of weather over in the Mediterranean world. So this is where Paul would have landed in Kavala. And then Paul traveled inland to Philippi. And we see that in Acts 16. And you see this area here. This is the Agora, which is Greek for the marketplace. So you can kind of see the steps on either side, this big open rectangular area. This is where shops would have been. This is kind of the hub of the city. Everyone would have been doing business here and teaching here. And so this is where Paul could have met Lydia, the lady that he baptized, the seller of purple. So this is where we believe Paul would have probably made his first stop. And you can probably see the road on the very bottom of the picture. That's the modern road that they have there today. But this would have been most likely the place where they would have had the Via Egnatia, so the ancient Roman road. Because the Romans occupied a lot of Europe, they made traveling super easy because they built all of these amazing roads that a lot of places still have the ancient road today. Unfortunately, I never got to take a picture of the ancient road, but there are places where you can still walk on that road. And so the road would have led Paul here to Philippi. And this area had 2 basilicas as well in Philippi. And basilicas are just churches, basically. And so you can see kind of those 3 tall towers in the back of the picture there, and that's where one basilica would have been. We think that maybe Paul would have went to the basilicas, maybe done some preaching there, since he would stay in these places for such a long period of time. And we also think that this might have been the possible home of St. Luke. So Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and the disciple of Jesus, we believe that he would have been born here. And so we'll continue by looking at Lydia here in Acts 16. From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer of purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. And so we see here that this was the area where we believe that Lydia was baptized. So in the top left there, in that picture, you can see the area where she would have, where they can today have baptisms. There's a couple steps that kind of lead into the little river there. And then on the right, you can just see the picture where the river is, and we believe that this would have been the place where Paul would have baptized her, where Lydia invited them into her home. And now Philippi, most famously known for when Paul was imprisoned, the jailer of Philippi, and we'll read this here. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in the house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. So on the left there is the traditional location of the prison of Paul that he was put into. And so this is what, for the longest time, they believed this was the prison where Paul was put in. Not necessarily this exact cell, but you can kind of see how very plain it is. It's just some stone on top of the ground, not very luxurious at all. But in modern times, this location has been put into question if this was actually the jail or not. So then, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen in that picture, we believe that this might have been the place where Paul would have been in prison. So kind of to the very right-hand side maybe up on that kind of snowy hill in the background. That's probably where the prison would have been. It hasn't been uncovered yet, but that's where we believe in modern times would have been the more likely place for the prison. But with the picture on the left, you can kind of get a visual of what prisons would have looked like back then. And so we continued our journeys following Paul to the city of Thessalonica. And so in all these pictures, you can kind of see the modern city of Thessaloniki, but this is where Paul would have been as well. And we'll read when Paul meets Jason in Acts 17. So when Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. "This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah," he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some of the bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. And so we see now, we're still on Paul's second missionary journey. And so now we're in this area. We're the Amphipolis, Apollonia, and then to Thessalonica. So we're following that blue line of Paul there. And so this is also Thessalonica, where Paul wrote his 2 letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. This is where he wrote those letters to. Not necessarily, he didn't write them in the city itself, but this is where he wrote to the believers there. And so this is the ancient part of the city. You can see it's surrounded by modern buildings, but this would have been the same thing we talked about in Philippi, the agora, so the marketplace. And you can see on the right there the big open space where people would have gathered, and you can see also the area on the left where people would sit in the theater and listen to people talk and plays and everything like that. So this is where Paul would have went and preached in all these areas. This is also where they would have probably met Jason. And we don't know exactly where Jason's house is, but this is where we believe Paul would have went to and where the riot started there in the city. And then we move on to Athens. So we see the Parthenon there in front of us, and this is where Paul would have made his Mars Hill, the Areopagus sermon, we can say. And so we'll read from Acts 17, selected verses. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." So when Paul said that he found an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God," basically the reason for having a statue or an altar was because, for example, if someone was out at sea and there was rough weather, there was storms, and then they were afraid for their lives, so they might have prayed, "Please, if there's a God out there that can hear me, please help me and save me." And if they survived and they came back to the city, they don't know exactly what God would have helped them, so they would have went to this altar for an unknown God, and they would have put an offering there, or maybe said a prayer to this unknown God for helping them in some way. So Paul's saying that all these people, they're smart, like, you guys know that there are gods out there, but let me tell you about the one true God. So he kind of used that as a segue to kind of get in and say, you guys are religious, let me tell you about our one true God that we have. So now, we're still on Paul's second missionary journey. We just left Thessalonica and Berea, and then he sailed down to Athens, and that's where we're at right now. And so here's the ancient city of Athens. You can see all the stones and the ruins around. So this is where Paul would have walked around. Paul would have been walking in these little paths, and he would have been seeing all these altars to unknown gods, and he would have been very saddened, I guess, by the view of all of those things. And so this is where Paul converted some of the Areopagus. So this is Mars Hill. This is where some of the Areopagus would have met. It's a very high point in the city, and so they would have kind of traveled on top of this big rock and probably would have gathered like we are here. And as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, that man standing there is Professor Stephen Geiger. He is my professor at the seminary, and any time we would travel to these big cities, we would stop as a group, and then we would have a little devotion and a Bible study. And here, Professor Geiger talked about what I just read from Scripture about how Paul met with the Areopagus and preached to them the true word of God and converted some of them. So this is where Paul would have been on this Mars Hill here. And so here's some other views from Mars Hill. I kind of took some pictures kind of panning around. So this is where Paul would have looked, and he would have looked up at the Acropolis, as you can see on the very bottom right, the Acropolis up there, and he would have, you can just imagine him pointing to that and saying, you guys are religious, look, you know these gods that you worship, that you think you know, but let me tell you about the one true God. So this is where Paul was speaking to the Areopagus here. And that's, like I said before, the Acropolis. This is where we see the Parthenon, and I'll show a couple pictures closer up. We got the opportunity to go up and be a little closer. So here's the Parthenon. As you can see, there are a lot of construction happening. This isn't 100% rebuilt. And if you see some of the areas where there may be like lighter marble, because this is all made of marble, so the lighter marble is all new stuff that they are meticulously carving and putting back in place to try to rebuild this thing. And we had the chance to go to the museum and see all of the ancient pieces that were on here that they brought inside to keep them safe. And I don't have any of those pictures in the presentation because this is more about talking about Paul. And obviously he wouldn't have spent a ton of time here at the Parthenon itself, but this is just to show you what we got to see here. And the cool thing about the Parthenon with these pictures, you might be able to see it a little bit, but the very base of it is curved. It's convex. So it's, if you can look on the left picture there, you can kind of see how it's curved a little bit. The base isn't completely flat. And that might seem a little strange, but these ancient Greeks knew how to build things. Because if you look back at a very long distance at it, it looks flat. But if it would be completely flat when you were up close and you backed away, it would look a little concave, so it wouldn't look correct. So they knew exactly how to use visuals to make everything look completely straight and flat and symmetrical, which is an amazing feat for them back then. And now we move on to Corinth, where we continue to see Paul leave Athens and then make his way to Corinth. And so we'll read here, Paul is revitalized. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believe and were baptized. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city." So Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the word of God. So Paul, being revitalized, was able to stay in Corinth much longer than I think he himself anticipated, because God said that he'd be with him. And so we are continuing on Paul's second missionary journey. Now we're here. So we traveled from Athens over to the Corinth area. Right here is a temple of Apollo. Kind of looks like a mini version of the Acropolis and the Parthenon. But we can see that these kind of temples were everywhere. So in every city that Paul went to, he sees these temples to these false gods, these old ancient Greek gods. And that's the kind of thing that Paul was up against. He was preaching to people who believed in all these different gods, but that also gave him that opportunity to say, you believe in gods, you know that there's this higher power out there. Let me tell you about the one true God. So it kind of gave him a foot in the door in a lot of these places. Then we see in Corinth, Paul was judged by Gallio. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. So this is where that proconsul would have been. We see back here, they brought him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio was there. So the picture on the left, you can kind of see up on that little raised platform, that's where Gallio would have been, the proconsul would have been. They would have been sitting there, and this probably would have been a covered area, obviously, but since it's so ancient, all the stones have eroded and fallen down. But they would have been sitting there, maybe discussing other things. And then so kind of where I'm standing taking the picture, and then on the right, where you can see all of our group standing there, is where they would have brought Paul. They would have brought Paul right there, set him down on the ground, and said, we have a problem with this man. And then Gallio, on top of where I'm standing on the right picture, taking the picture, would have said, this isn't my problem. This is about him saying these things about your law, so go take care of it yourselves. So this is where Paul would have been brought in front of Gallio here. Here's some more pictures of ancient Corinth. You can see here in this picture, kind of in the center there, you see those little entrances, those little caves, I guess you can say. And this is where a little bathhouse would have been, a little marketplace would have been. And so we see in ancient Corinth, and when Paul writes to the letter of the Corinthians, this is where we believe that idol meat would have been sold. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols. So in old Jewish customs, it was wrong to do that because it was given to the Lord. Everything was supposed to be burned. But now, in these more modern times for them, they would only sacrifice part of animals and give them, or maybe they would just kind of cook them and sacrifice them, and then they would keep some of the meat for themselves because they had to eat. And so this would have been a place where they would have taken that meat that was sacrificed to idols and sold it. And some of the Jews had issue with that, but Paul said, no, it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols because you're not eating the meat and worshiping that God. You're just buying sustenance for yourself, so that's an okay thing. So this would have been the shops and the area where Paul would have kind of mingled with people and done a lot of his talking and preaching for that over a year that he was there. And here's another picture of our group gathering together and having a little Bible study about the city of Corinth and a little devotion and then singing a couple hymns, and just an incredible thing to be in a place where Paul himself walked and being able to worship the same God there thousands of years later. Just an incredible experience that I wish every Christian had the opportunity to do. Now we traveled to Italy. So we left Greece after about a week of being there, and then we flew from Athens all the way over to Italy, and we landed in Rome, but that's not where we began our trip. So we landed in Rome and drove a little south along the coast, and we stayed in Caserta for a few days, and then we traveled to the ancient city of Pompeii, where we know the famous story of that volcano exploding, and that obviously didn't have anything to do with Paul, but we got the opportunity to take a look at that city that was destroyed by the volcano, and then we traveled back up to Rome, where we did a lot of our touring there. And so we'll see where Paul finally made it to Rome in Acts 28. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there, we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. The next day, the south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli, where we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend the week with them. And so we came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. And if you remember, we took a look at this more in depth in our last Bible study when Paul arrived in Rome. And now I'll kind of put a couple pictures to it if I can here. So again, this map looks familiar to you. We look at Paul's journey to Rome. And this is after his 3rd missionary journey when he was traveling back and visiting all the places he was before. And this is kind of his final journey, or his 4th missionary journey, his journey to Rome. So we know that this is where he was shipwrecked, that he was traveling through the Adriatic Sea, kind of in that really long stretch of that golden line where he was out there for 2 weeks in the middle of the sea and then finally landed at Malta. And then we see him go from Syracuse up to Rhegium, and then they found the south wind, sailed up to Puteoli, traveled past the 3 taverns, and then finally arrived in Rome. And so here's Puteoli. This is where we believe Paul would have landed when he sailed up here. So really an incredible thing to see where he first landed in Europe and Greece, and now where he landed in Italy for the first time. Such an incredible thing to see. And so here's the ancient city of Rome. We were able to take a look at, we drove past the 3 taverns that were talked about. Unfortunately, we were on the bus and passed by it so quickly that I was unable to get a good picture of it. Plus, there wasn't a lot that they had excavated yet, so we weren't able to get good pictures of it. But we did pass by the ancient road that Paul would have traveled when he headed up the coast to Rome once he finally landed in Puteoli. So now we made it to Rome, and this is where we did a lot of our touring. And when we were in Rome, there are fewer sites that we can directly link to the events from Paul's ministry, just because we don't know a lot of things that Paul did when he was in Rome. All we know that he was in that guarded house, and we don't know where that house is. Plus, a lot of things in Rome obviously have to do with the Vatican now, so the Roman Catholic Church. So most of our travels throughout the city of Rome were just looking at the Catholic basilicas and all of these ancient sites from Rome. So that was a cool thing. But let's read these verses here from Acts 28. Go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and turn, I would heal them. Therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So when God's saying that you will be ever hearing but never understanding, you will be ever seeing but never perceiving, he's talking about the Jews. So his own people that grew up with these Old Testament laws, they were so focused on them that they failed to see Jesus. They failed to see all the prophecies fulfilled in Christ, the Messiah. So now God's saying, if they're not going to listen to what you have to say, if they're not going to listen to my word, my son, then turn to the Gentiles and they will listen. So this is what Paul did when he was in Rome. And so the first stop that we made here was in St. Paul's Basilica. So one of probably the top 5 biggest basilicas there. This is where they believe that the Apostle Paul was buried. And so here's kind of the inside of it. You can just see how ornate all of these basilicas are. Everything made with just marble and gold and all of these beautiful portraits. And if you can see on that left-hand picture there, you can see all those circular pictures kind of running through the middle. Those are all the popes. So in this basilica, every single pope that has ever been a pope, starting from St. Peter to the present day, they have all the pictures of them in there. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, this is where they believe that St. Paul was buried. And again, we're not 100% sure, but this is where they believe that he was buried. So they kind of had an area where you can look into his tomb, so to speak, where he was buried there. And here's another picture of the front of St. Paul's Basilica. This is where they hold services every once in a while. You can see the altar there in the front and just how ornate and beautiful everything is. And since they believe that this, and we kind of believe that this is where Paul was buried, we know that that some ancient fathers suggest that St. Paul was beheaded in Rome under Nero. So anytime between like 64 to 68 AD is when we believe Paul was beheaded in this area, and this is where he might have been buried. So now we'll get to kind of the highlight of Rome, which is St. Peter's Basilica, the most famous basilica in the whole world, where we see a lot of things happening with the Roman Catholic Pope. This church, this basilica, was built in the 1500s and continually being renovated and made larger and larger so that it is the biggest basilica that there is today, and they make sure that it is the biggest basilica. And we know that this was partially funded by the sale of indulgences. So the very thing that Martin Luther was fighting to get rid of, those indulgences that you pay to help get your relatives out of purgatory and yourself out of purgatory, all that money was collected and eventually, we know, made to become this basilica that we see today. And you can just see how massive this is. If you can see kind of that gate that's right up front alongside the basilica, you can see the people there. So just a giant, giant church. Amazing to see. And then here's kind of a view from the steps up front. This is the big kind of area there where everyone would gather when the Pope makes an announcement or when he comes out, and you can see a Christmas tree there. This is where they kind of have their celebration and where people gather frequently. And here's inside of St. Peter's Basilica. So where I'm standing is where the front door of St. Paul's Basilica would be. So just to show you how incredibly big St. Peter's is, where I'm standing on the top left picture, I'm standing where the front doors of St. Paul's would be facing forward. And then in the top right picture, I turn around and I take a picture of how much more space St. Peter's takes up. That's how large it is. And between these red curtains in the center here, they have, you can see on the bottom picture, that little nameplate, the Basilica of St. Paul. And throughout that entire area there, they have all these names of the basilicas and where their front doors will be. So basically just saying, we're bigger than this basilica and this one and this one. So just showing how absolutely gigantic this place is. And just to compare St. Peter's with St. Paul's Basilica, the length of St. Peter's, 730 feet, the width, 500 feet, the height, 448 feet, and the square footage, 163,000. In St. Paul's, we see the length is only 490 feet, the width is only 260, and the height is only 240. And I couldn't, for some reason, find the square footage of St. Paul's, and it's not as easy as just multiplying length and width because it's not a perfect square or rectangle, so I didn't know exactly how big it is, but just looking at the length, width, and height, it's really easy to see that St. Peter's is indeed the biggest basilica in the world. And so here's a better look at the altar up front there. You can just see how ornate and huge it is. You can see all of the intricate working with the gold up front, everything carved out of marble, all the statues where a lot of old popes were buried. And just if you stand right in front of the altar and if you go straight down into the ground, that's where they believe St. Peter was buried. And that's why they mistakenly understood when Jesus said, "You, Peter, on you I will build my church." And they literally believe that they built their church on St. Peter, but in reality, Jesus was saying, on your confession, I'm going to build my church. But we see that the Catholics take that literally, that they built their church on top of St. Peter, the first pope. And if you can see where I put that little red circle, that's a person standing up there. So just showing you absolutely how humongous this place was. It's just absolutely breathtaking to go in there and see everything that was in there. We also got the chance to see the Pieta, that statue of Mary holding Jesus after he was taken down from the cross, and just an incredible thing to see. But I didn't know this at the time, but after I got back, I found out that, or after we left the basilica rather, that a few years ago someone came and just smashed the face off of Mary on the Pieta, but they since repaired it and it looks just like it did when it was first carved, but you can't get that close to it anymore. They have a cage up so you can't actually go up and see it that close, but just to see everything in here was incredible. We also got the opportunity to go down in the catacombs. So you can see this kind of diagram looking at the side of the basilica there. You can see the altar kind of on the left-hand side of the picture there. So if we go straight down and you see that pink area below, that's where a lot of old popes were buried. So just a lot of tombs down there and a lot of areas where the popes were buried after they passed away. And then the blue area is the catacombs that we had the privilege to go and take a look at. But on the very left-hand side of that blue is where they believe St. Peter was buried. So again, like I said, right below that front altar there. And just to put this kind of into perspective, they didn't allow us to take pictures down there. But I was a little sneaky and took a couple pictures because I just wanted to be able to keep this in my memory forever. So if you look on the left-hand side, and you might see that little hole kind of in the middle of the screen that goes all the way back. That's where they believe that St. Peter was buried. And this is as far as we could go. There was a gate standing in our way, but that's where they believe he was. And we got to take a look at a box that was full of bone fragments that they believe were St. Peter's. We aren't exactly 100% sure, but they believe that those are St. Peter's bones. And then this picture on the right here is just an area where people would have been buried. These ancient places were just areas where you bought out this entire area and your whole family was buried there when you all passed away. So these are some of the pictures that we got to see down in the catacombs. We also got to go see the Sistine Chapel. A very famous, we see all the paintings up there, specifically the one in the middle with God and Adam almost touching fingers there. Again, the Sistine Chapel was an area where you weren't allowed to take pictures because this was a church, and it's the church that the Pope often goes into and does some silent meditation and prayer. But the reason why I snuck this picture, you can see my chin on the top right, is because if you pay enough money, you can take as many pictures as you want in there, like a private little showing of you, and you can just go in there and take all the pictures you want. So I figured I'm not going to support the Roman Catholic Church. I'm just going to sneak a quick picture, and nobody caught me, thankfully. So there's a picture of the Sistine Chapel there. There's again that picture of that. I went back to the Sistine Chapel, and then the Pantheon, so another very famous building here in Rome. And if you go inside the Pantheon, you can kind of see that the front door I took a picture of, and the last slide here is looking outside. And on the right-hand side, you can see I'm looking at the ceiling there, and that big circle up top, that's just an open circle looking into the sky. And you might think, well, if it rains in there, then wouldn't the rain just come in and soak the place? Well, because of the winds and the draft that comes through the door and through that little grate there above the door, the air flies up and goes through that hole. So it keeps most of the rain out. So they hardly ever get rain in there. So just a cool piece of technological work that they built way back in the day. And we made our way to the Colosseum, another very famous site in Rome, such a cool place to see. And obviously very under construction. And if you can see kind of where all that scaffolding was, that would have been where the main floor was. And the main floor would have been covered in sand, most likely, and they would have had, obviously, we hear about the battles that would have happened in there. They would have brought all of these like prisoners and maybe some slaves in there, and they would have put them to battle against animals. And in some cases, they would have had trap doors that would open up, and the animals would pop up from under the ground, and they would starve the animals so that they would be extra crazy, and they would want to kill the people that they threw in there. And we also know that they would have flooded this place with water, and they would have had kind of naval battles. They would have brought ships in, and they would have kind of been sailing around, and they would have been fighting each other. So a really cool place to see. And hopefully in the years to come, they get enough funds to kind of fix this back up to how it used to be. And that's kind of where we ended our tour. Again, not a lot of things that we looked at the Apostle Paul in Rome, just because we don't have a lot of those places today. But that was the trip. And there are a lot more things that we got to see that didn't really have anything to do with the Apostle Paul. But if you have any questions, please feel free to talk to me about it, and I'll be more than happy to show you pictures and talk more about it. But that was it. That was a little Footsteps of Paul tour. I hope this kind of gave you some visualization to see some pictures to put with the places that we read about all the time in the Bible. And just to be there was such an incredible experience, looking at how God blessed the spread of the gospel message through the Apostle Paul, through the other apostles, and all the good things that happened in the Mediterranean world back in the first century. And again, thanks for joining me throughout the summer as we looked at the Apostle Paul, and God's blessings to you this week of grace.